students, we're back. We're back with our topic of genetics. And we're going to finish up our notes here today on this topic. And hopefully you remember from yesterday where we left off. We left off yesterday with this part of our notes talking about how genetics is the study of heredity. Heredity is the passing of traits to offspring, and traits are the characteristics of an organism, such as hair color, eye color, skin color, etc. So we're going to pick it up from here and hopefully have your books open to your notes page. And let's now talk about genes. This is very, very important. There's probably no other part of the study of genetics more important than determining the right genes for you. Personally, I prefer a more loose-fitting gene that are more comfortable and flexible and that have expandable waistlines, because the older I get, my belly gets a little bit larger and it's rather uncomfortable to be constricted when I sit down. No. Hopefully you have picked up on the fact that this is the wrong kind of genes. These genes are GEANS. We want to talk about the genes that are GENES. So let's get to it. Genes, GENES, are a unit of heredity, And we're going to be talking about different kinds of genes here in a moment. But think about the previous two topics where we were talking about chromosomes and DNA, and try to remember the fact that our genes are this little unit of heredity, this little portion, if you will. If you remember this model of DNA that you made in the past, different segments, different segments of our DNA control specific information that determines our different traits. And those different little sections are called genes. So genes essentially are a small portion of the larger strand of DNA, which make up the even larger collection of DNA in our chromosomes. So there's, again, if you think back to our topic on DNA, there's a lot of information. But genes are the basic unit of heredity. These are these things that determine the traits or characteristics. Now also think back to a previous topic where we learned about meiosis. Raise your hand if you can remember anything about meiosis. Hopefully you remember the difference between mitosis and meiosis. Mitosis is the duplication and division of a cell's nucleus. Meiosis is the production of sex cells. Now, here's another question for you. Who can remember? Raise your hand if you can remember what happens to the number of chromosomes during meiosis. Very good. They are halved. They are cut in half. The sex cells are produced with half the number of chromosomes that it takes to produce a full creature, organism, human being, plant, whatever critter we might be talking about. And the reason for that is because during sexual reproduction, half of the information, the genetic information, the chromosomes come from one parent, and the other half come from the other parent. And so when you have two halves coming together, it makes a whole. That's why meiosis is so important. And that leads us to the next point here in our discussion of genes, because half of our genes come from our mommy, half of our genes come from our daddy. And you have had lots of questions so far about, well, why do I have some genes that are more prevalent in my mom? Why do I look more like my dad? Why am I this way? Why am I that way? Or some of you might have questions, if I have children someday, what might they look like? What kind of characteristics or traits might they have? Will they share more from me or from my spouse? Well, here's the nitty-gritty of the details that we need to explain to answer those kinds of questions, because not all genes are the same. There are those that are more dominant than others. There are dominant genes which refer to those that have a stronger trait. Now, I have the little picture here of a weightlifter that looks really strong with big muscles and all that good stuff. It's not necessarily that kind of strength that we're talking about when we refer to genetics, but it's not a bad analogy here. A stronger trait, while you're writing this down, I want to emphasize something to you, because this is going to be so super duper important as we continue with this topic. Notice the capitalization of the letter. I am using the letter T here to represent a trait of some kind. That's why I'm using the letter T. But notice the capitalization. I'm using a capital letter T to represent the stronger trait. A stronger trait or a dominant trait, when we write it down, is always represented by a capital letter for dominant trait, as opposed to a recessive trait or the weaker trait, which we always abbreviate or represent or illustrate with a lowercase letter. So when you're writing this down in your notes, I can't emphasize enough the importance of neatness and being able to read your own writing and being able to distinguish between capital letters and lowercase letters. Hopefully you see the difference between a capital T and a lowercase t. Super important as we continue here. So, what kind of letter are dominant traits represented with? Capitals. And what type of letters do we represent recessive traits with? Lowercase letters. Very good. So make sure, regardless of what letter we might be using throughout our discussion, capital letters are dominant, lowercase letters are recessive. So capitalization counts here. So let's move on to our next term. Our next term here in our study of genetics is something called a zygote. And so let me introduce you to zygote. Perhaps that brought a little chuckle to you. Again, this is simply a play on words. This is not a zygote in the sense of genetics. Yes, some of you might have goats at home, and some of you might have even named them Zy, but this kind of a goat is Goat. The kind of goat we are talking about is Gote. So there's a difference between Zy the goat and zygote. Zygote, very simply put, is a fertilized egg. So when a mommy and a daddy really love each other and they get together, the father's sperm fertilizes the mother's egg, and at that point, it becomes a fertilized egg. The one word used in science to describe a fertilized egg is a zygote. So a zygote, fertilized egg. Now, this is really important to remember some of these words here because we're going to be adding prefixes and changing nouns into adjectives and understanding the basic vocabulary and understanding some prefixes are going to go a long way in helping you understand how we're going to be finishing up here today with our notes and the lab activity tomorrow. So let's continue with building on the word zygote. Notice this next term called homozygous. Does anyone know what the prefix homo means? Homo refers to something that is similar or the same. So when we put homo in front of zygous, and by the way, do you see ZYGO? Very similar to zygote. And we can add an OUS at the end of a word to make it an adjective. So homozygous is a word that literally means a zygote that contains all one trait or all the same kind of trait. And another word, a similar word, a synonym for homozygous is purebred. A purebred technically is a homozygous creature, contains all one trait. Now that could be either two capital letters or two lowercase letters, or what do the capital letters stand for? Dominant, both dominant traits, or two lowercase letters, and the lowercase letters refer to recessive, two recessive traits. Again, there are two letters here in our examples because one comes from the father, one comes from the mother. And we as complete organisms have both. We are a combination of both parents. So homozygous means purebred, means contains all one trait, either both dominant or both recessive, and we illustrate that by our choice of capitalization in our letters. So how many of you have ever heard of a purebred before? In what context have you heard of purebreds? Maybe dogs, right? Dogs can be purebreds, and they have a pedigree. If they are in fact a purebred, they have a pedigree, which is a fancy name of saying a family tree that shows the characteristics of the dog's parents to prove with a paper pedigree to prove that this is in fact a purebred. Don't ever buy a purebred for thousands of dollars without having a paper pedigree to prove it. Otherwise, you could have just spent a lot of money on an animal that you could have gotten for a lot cheaper because it might not truly be a purebred. Personally, I prefer these kind of dogs, mutts. I prefer a mutt. But let's talk about what a mutt is, okay? A mutt is not a homozygous critter. It is a heterozygous animal. Now, heterozygous, homozygous, they look very similar except for the prefix. A heterozygous, the prefix hetero, anyone know what the prefix hetero means? Well, it means different. So a heterozygous organism, which is also called a hybrid, contains mixed traits. Now, notice the letters here. Mixed traits. We have one capital and one lowercase letter. And because there's one dominant, one recessive, we call that a hybrid or a heterozygous. And so who's awesome? I think hybrids are awesome. I think mutts are awesome. In fact, genetically speaking, hybrids tend to be healthier. Organisms that have mixed traits are genetically typically healthier than a purebred because there's greater genetic diversity found within the organism. So I've always owned mutts. I think mutts generally have fewer health issues associated with them, and they just make good pets, in my opinion. But I'm not against purebreds, but there are genetic problems that do arise with many purebreds. Some larger breeds like shepherds and retrievers, if they're purebred, they tend to end up with hip dysplasia, hip problems when they're older in life, and they have lots of problems in that regard. Other organisms, other dogs like pugs, bulldogs, they might have sinus issues because of that characteristic trait that has been bred in them that makes them a purebred, but it also opens up some genetic potential issues in their lives as well. So personally, I prefer hybrids. I like mutts, probably because I'm a mutt. I'm made up of many different ethnic backgrounds, and so I'm a mutt myself. I'm heterozygous. But let's continue on this discussion. And two more terms I want to introduce to you are extremely important as we prepare for the next phase of our study of genetics. So the first one is called phenotype. Everybody look at the word and say it together. Phenotype. The PH in this word is pronounced as an F. The PH is pronounced like an F. So say it one more time as you're looking at it. Phenotype. All right, so what the heck is phenotype? Well, the phenotype of an organism, and we're talking generally speaking about humans today, but again, it can be dogs, cats, animals, it can be all sorts of organisms, plants. A phenotype is the physical appearance that you see on the outside. Now, in your notes, I'm giving you a little memory aid here. Notice how I've underlined the PH in phenotype. I'd like you to do that yourself in your notes. Notice the PH is underlined in physical appearance. Do that yourself in your notes, because the way I remember it is I think of how they are spelled and pronounced. Phenotype, physical phenotype. The phenotype is the physical appearance. It's what you see on the outside. My phenotype is brown hair. My phenotype is whatever color my eyes are. My phenotype of my skin is my skin color. My height is my phenotype. The things that are the physical appearance, the things that can be seen on the outside, phenotype. That's contrasted with our next word, genotype. Again, starts with a GE, genotype, and our genotype is our genetic makeup. So in your notes, right now in your notes, underline GE under genotype and underline the GE in the genetic makeup, because the genotype is the genetic makeup of an organism. Now, we can see the phenotype on the outside. The genotype is what's on the inside. We can't see that without special equipment like microscopes and various testing equipment for DNA. In fact, if you've ever participate or know somebody who's ever had their DNA tested in say 32andMe or Ancestry.com, one of these companies, they actually take your genetic makeup, they take your genotype and unravel it all and give you a family history based on your genotype, not necessarily your phenotype. They may never have seen you, but they have seen your insides once you give them a sample of your DNA. Now, notice the examples I've given you here of your genotype. I've given you two examples, capital T, lowercase t, and capital T, capital T. There are many different combinations, many different examples, but I want to ask you, see how much you've been paying attention. I want to ask you, what is the technical term for the first example of genotype here? The capital T, lowercase t, what is that an example of? All right, hopefully you said hybrid or heterozygous, because you'll see the capital T, lowercase t, that is a combination of a dominant and a recessive trait. So it is a hybrid or heterozygous. How about the second example there? Both uppercase or capital letters. First, my question is it dominant or recessive? Good job, dominant. My second question to you is, would that be an example of a homozygous or heterozygous? Nice job. Homozygous or purebred dominant. Purebred dominant or homozygous dominant would be the capital T, capital T. I know we're talking about a lot of different funky words here, but if you understand the prefixes of these words, it will help you understand the meaning of the words, which will really help you in applying the words to our examples here and enable you to understand the next phase of our study in genetics, which will allow you to answer some other really cool questions. So let's move on. Again, what makes you you? We talked about this yesterday, if you recall, but you don't have to copy this down. I just want you to look at it for a moment, okay? Let's say we've got a mum. This is from England, by the way, where people call their mom mum. Let's say you have a mum that is a tongue roller and a dad who is not a tongue roller. Well, as we discussed the other day, rolling your tongue is a dominant trait. So let's say your mom is a tongue roller who happens to be capital T, or homozygous dominant. In order to be a non-tongue roller, that is a recessive trait, then your dad would be a homozygous recessive. Both the same, lowercase letters, homozygous recessive. Now, what is the likelihood that the children will be a tongue roller or a non-tongue roller if the parents are like this? Well, it ultimately has to do with meiosis, the production of sex cells here from both of your parents, and how they possibly can join together. Now, this diagram, in my opinion, is a little bit confusing to follow. Yeah, you can follow the arrows and you can figure it out, but we're going to be going over a different way of determining the possible offspring. But I mentioned this word possible. We have to discuss right now something that you may have encountered in math class called probability. So let's just take a moment to talk about probability first. Probability, as you might remember from math, is the possibility or the likelihood that an event will happen. Whether we're talking about the weather, and we are talking about the probability of snow tomorrow, or rain today, or the probability of sunshine, whatever the weather might be, you'll always hear weather reporters talking about probability or the percentage, the likelihood that something will happen. Well, let's go to the close-up view and let me give you some examples here. Here I have a coin. Now, I know it's not a real coin. It's a piece of wood. It's a wood chip, not a cow chip, a wood chip. It's a wood chip that I've labeled with an H on one side and a T on the other side to represent heads and tails. Now, as with a coin, any coin, and I could take out a coin for you if you want. If you'd rather see a coin, but coins, and I've written all over these coins here. Let's take a penny, for instance. A penny, oh my goodness, a penny doesn't want to come out of the drawer here. Here we go. Okay. A penny is a coin. It's a two-sided coin. It's got a heads and it's got a tails, but it's a little bit difficult to see on the camera. So let's stick with the wood chip. Heads and tails. How many sides are there on a coin? 2. There's a heads and there's a tails. Now, if I flip this coin, how many sides are going to be facing up when it lands on the table? 1. Every time I flip this coin, it is going to have one side of it facing up. So I'm going to flip it here. And this time it was tails up. Can you see that on camera? Yeah. I'm going to flip it again. This time it was heads up. Every time I flip a coin, it has a 1 in 2 probability or likelihood or possibility that it's going to be one side or the other. In other words, a 1 in 2 chance that it's going to be heads or tails. No matter how many times you flip the coin, there's a 50% chance, a 1 in 2 chance that it's going to be heads and a 50% chance that it's going to be tails. Now, yeah, you might have a streak of heads, heads, heads. Wow, 3 times in a row. But every time you flip the coin, it's always a 50% chance that it's going to be heads or tails. Now, let's take another object. Let's take a rolling dice or die. I never remember. Help me out. Which one is singular? Which one is plural? Is this 1 dice or die? And is this 2 die or dice? Well, I don't remember. Which is correct? Which is singular? Which is plural? I'm just going to call it a dotted cube. So here I have a dotted cube. This one I think is a little bit easier. My first question to you is this. How many sides are on a dotted cube? Hopefully you said 6. There are 6 sides to a cube. Now, when you roll one of these dotted cubes, how many sides face up every time it lands on the table? Hopefully you said 1. So every time you roll a die, or every time you roll one of these dotted blocks or dotted cubes, only one side is going to be facing up. So every time you roll the cube, you have a 1 in 6 chance, a 1 in 6 chance that one of the numbers is going to be facing up. So every time you roll it, you've got a 1 in 6 chance. So what is the probability that this dotted cube is going to land with the 6 dots facing up? It's a 1 in 6 chance, folks. Every time you roll it, it's a 1 in 6 chance. That was 5. That was 5. Ooh, that was 1. Ooh, that was 5 again. 3, 4, 4, 2, 3. I'm trying to get a 6 here. Oh, so close. Oh, one more. Ah, there we go. I finally got a 6. Now, it may take more than 6 times to get it, but every time you roll it, there's a 1 in 6 chance it's going to roll a certain number up. So what does this all have to do with genetics? Well, let's head back to our notes and find out. Probability, once again. Oops. Oh my, wrong button there. Okay. Probability, once again, is the possibility or the likelihood that an event will happen, and the probability that I will hit the right button this time, I'm thinking will be a 100% probability. Yes, I got it. Okay. Some examples of probability include flipping a coin, winning the lottery. And by the way, you have a greater chance, a greater probability of being struck by lightning during a rainstorm than winning the mega lottery for billions of dollars. The rain, probability of rain, and the characteristics of your offspring or the offspring of any organism is up to probability. So let's explore this a little bit further. There is a tool or a device that scientists use to help determine the probability of offspring, and it's called a Punnett square. And I am going to stop our video at this point, and we're going to pick up next time learning about Punnett squares. So for now, I'm going to say bye-bye.